Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT patch rundown video. Today we'll be diving into the newest patch 1022 and all the changes that come with it. Overall, this patch won't be as aggressive with changes as a lot of the meta issues were addressed in the hotfix for 1021. That said, we've seen the upper end of the meta be a bit too stale, with builds like Ahri and Sharpshooters dominating, so 1022 should lower their power a bit and diversify the options that you can play. With all that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helps make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we get into trait, champion, and item changes, there's two quick system changes to talk about. Neither of these changes will affect the game much, as they mostly have to do with quality of life. First is that players will now take at minimum 1 damage when they lose. 1 health won't matter much, but it will be much more intuitive for players that losing means taking damage, as there were some situations that you could lose around and not lose any health. The second quality of life improvement is that you'll now be able to see chosen roll chances within the shop tooltip. Again, this won't matter much outside of giving players extra information in regards to the chosen mechanic, which is definitely a welcome addition to the game. Hopefully they continue to roll out minor changes like this to provide information in-game instead of turning to outside sources. That's it for the system. Let's now move on and talk about trait changes. First up, we have cultists. Cultist ran into an issue after it received a scaling change, as having a chosen cultist ended up being a downside. The reason is the Galio scales with the level of each cultist champion, so if you have one less cultist because one of them is chosen, you're getting a bit less in terms of scaling. While the upfront power spike of hitting a 2-star champion is nice, it does noticeably decrease the value of having a chosen cultist later on. To address it, they've made it so that a cultist chosen now counts as 2 cultists, meaning Galio will now get double the amount of star levels for 1 champion. It's a necessary change to help cultists scale better later on in the game, and should make 6 cultists a much more appealing option. Next, we have a similar change for Keeper. The fact that Keeper Chosen has always counted as 1 Keeper seemed like an odd downside for the trait that isn't all that powerful to begin with. So, like Cultist, when you have a chosen Keeper, that champion will now count as 2 and grant double the amount of shields. This makes early Keeper quite strong if you hit an Elise Chosen, as well as a mid-game power spike of hitting a Kennen or Riven Chosen. It won't affect the scaling of Keeper later on in the game, but it should be a noticeable buff early on. Dazzler is up next, as the trait is receiving 2 changes. For starters, the attack damage reduction that the trait provides is being changed from 50% at both tiers to now being 50% for 2 Dazzler and 80% for 4. This is quite the change, as 80% damage reduction is, well, a lot. Maybe even a bit too much. But at the same time, it does mean committing to at least 3 units for Dazzler, or if you don't have a chosen unit. That's not inherently a bad thing, but keep in mind Dazzler only affects attack damage, so it won't matter much against comps using Ahri, for example. The second change alters the duration of damage reduction from 15 seconds to 8 seconds for both tiers. The duration matters less, but it does make 2 Dazzler more appealing. So looking at both of these changes, 2 Dazzler is slightly better and 4 Dazzler is more effective at a shorter duration. Overall, it means Dazzler will potentially rise again as a counter to attack damage builds, but again, committing 4 champions to this trait may be less than ideal. Ninja, or at least 4 Ninja, is doing a bit too well, so they're toning down the bonus AP and AD to 140 from 150. It will affect builds using a Kali or Zed carry, but overall it's not really going to cause the composition to disappear entirely, as it's really not that significant of a nerf. And the last trait change is the Sharpshooters. The damage reduction per ricochet is going to 55-50-45% from 65-50-35%. Basically, 2 Sharpshooters is more effective, and 6 Sharpshooters is less effective. This is a nice way to address the trait, because it was clear that 6 was way too good and the other tiers really didn't matter much. Now we may see more flexible compositions utilizing 2 Sharpshooters and less of a focus on rushing to 6. With that said, though, the strength of 6 Sharpshooters isn't inherently tied to the damage of the ricochets, it's the fact that your Teemo and Jinx spread their CC to an additional target. We'll see how this nerf to 6 Sharpshooters affects the composition in 1022. Time now to talk about champion changes. Fiora starts us off with her receiving an alteration to what her chosen bonus is. Instead of gaining a health bonus as a chosen, she now has her max mana reduced. This is actually a meaningful change, as you'll be able to play around Fiora as an early game carry, since you'll be able to cast her ability more often. Next is an interesting modification to the targeting of Lissandra. Instead of casting her ability on the target she's attacking, she will now aim at the champion with the highest attack damage. This is a significant change as you can use Lissandra with Dazzler to specifically target enemy carries. And the last one-cost champion to cover is Vayne. Vayne seems to continually get minor buffs, and this patch is no different, as her passive damage is going from 40, 75, 120 to 50, 90, 140. This, along with the 2 sharpshooter buffs, may make her a real threat in the early game as a carry. There is a possibility of a reroll composition utilizing her as a carry, but we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. The only 2-cost champion receiving changes in this patch is Vi. First, like Fiora, her chosen bonus is being changed. Instead of bonus health, she'll have her max mana reduced. It may be a good change, especially since she already gets bonus health as a brawler, but it does hurt her ability to tank. The other 2 changes are to her ability. First, the damage at tier 3 is going up to 800 from 600. The amount of armor shred duration will now be 8 seconds instead of 6. Basically, her ability is going to be more effective and she'll cast more often as a chosen champion, which are both good changes for her. Akali has been casting a bit too often, so she'll now be mana locked for 1.25 seconds instead of just 1 after casting. It's a minor change, but should be an effective way to reduce her damage output. Evelynn is one of the weaker 3-cost champions, even if you 3-star her, so they're buffing her damage at level 3 to be 1400 instead of 900. This is a huge increase, so we may see more 3-star Evelynns in 1022. Nunu is receiving a similar buff, though he is actually already a really strong 3-star. But despite that, his ability damage is going up to 1800 from 1300 at tier 3, which is basically going to kill most champions, meaning late game Nunu should be a scary threat. Up next is a nerf to Ahri. We've seen her nerf several times and still be effective, so they're lowering her damage from 500 750 to 475 675. It certainly won't be enough to take her out of the meta, but should make her AoE slightly less destructive. Ashe fell out of the meta a bit, but she may rise back up as there was actually a bug that caused 4 out of her 5 flurry shots to not hit critically or be dodged. Basically what this means is that you can now give her an infinity edge and her damage output should be much, much higher. Morgana is receiving a minor change to make her spell targeting less random. It's not much, but hey, any buffs that help her diversify the meta. And now we're on to the 5-cost champions, of which there's quite a few, starting with Ezreal. It's not much, but Ezreal's starting mana will now be 90, up from 75. This means that he'll get his first cast off earlier in the fight, which is great. But he's basically still going to be a 1-cast wonder. That said, we can't complain about making him a better pickup as a late-game champion. Lee Sin is a bit too good late game, especially since his ultimate is an unhealthy mechanic for the game. To lower his strength, they're reducing the duration of his initial stun to 1.52 seconds from 3-4 seconds. It's a nice change as a 4-second stun is a really long time. He should still be strong in 1022, but hopefully less frustrating to play against. Lilia continues to be an underwhelming 5-cost champion, so they're once again attempting to buff her by making the damage to break her sleep 500 across all star levels. Hopefully this makes her a viable option late game, but we may need to see more aggressive changes to her in future patches. Unfortunately, Set fell out of the meta and hasn't been able to find his way back in. Sure, in a brawler comp, he's a must-have, but his ability is just too unreliable and sometimes doesn't even cast. So they're giving him 2 changes to try to beef up the boss once again. First is, as a chosen, he will instead gain bonus spell power instead of health. It's a nice change, but honestly the rarity of finding a chosen set makes this change kind of pointless. The second and more relevant buff is to his spell's damage. The primary target will now take 40-60% max health, up from 35-45%. It's a significant buff for a 2-star set. We'll have to see if it's enough to pull him back into the meta. That's it for champion changes, so let's move on to the last section of the patch, item changes. They don't want Luden's Echo to be too effective like Static Shiv was, so instead of the bonus damage affecting both crowd-controlled units and shielded targets, it instead will now only proc on CC targets. It's a nice change, as it should keep the item being usable on specific champions without being too good. Death Cap has been outshadowed by other spell power items for quite a while, especially after Chalice was buffed. So to help this item out, they're increasing the spell power gained to 75 from 70. It's not much, but maybe enough to make it a viable option again. Ruin's Hurricane is getting a huge buff as the extra bolts will now do 100% instead of just 75%. This makes it a viable option for attack damage carry champions, and we may see it used on the newly buffed Vayne to make her a viable carry in 1022. So Static Shiv was clearly too powerful in 1021, which is why they hotfixed it. but the hotfix made it not that ideal of an item, so they're buffing the base damage to 80 from 75. In addition to that, the bonus damage is going from 175 to a whopping 240, but keep in mind that the bonus damage is only to shielded champions. So while this is a ton of bonus true damage, it is very niche. We're sure everyone expected this, but Zeke's Herald is being nerfed with the bonus attack speed going down to 35% from 40%. Will it still be an effective item? Most likely. Will we see it slammed less often? Definitely. Keep in mind that changes that look minor, like a 5% nerf, often have much larger impacts than the number alludes to. We expect it to still be a functional item to use, but it may not be as popular as it was in 1021. And the last changes of the patch are to ZZ Rot Portal. ZZ Rot became an insanely good item after they added the taunt functionality. But that taunt has been a bit too effective and had odd consequences on fights, as units would move around far too much to get to the champion that taunted them. This messed up unit pathing a lot, sometimes to the detriment of the player that had the ZZ Rot. So they're changing the duration of the taunt from 2 seconds down to 1. While it is a nerf, it's actually just more of a quality of life change. And that's all for today's video, folks. While there weren't huge changes in this patch, there should be enough to hopefully make the meta a bit more diverse. That said, don't expect popular builds like Sharpshooter or Ahri carry to just disappear. Let us know in the comment section below what you're most excited for with the new patch. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.